speaker for this session is Kate Sturla. Kate works as a director in analytics with experience in research, evaluation, and right-sizing M&E frameworks. She's worked at ID Insights, where she was director, the innovation team, and led projects in education, health, and agriculture, including the evaluation of India's first development impact fund. Before that, she managed several studies for the Behavioral Development Lab in Chennai and worked as a classroom teacher for an educational non-profit in northwestern India. Kate holds an MPA in International Development. So, welcome, Kate.
Hi, everyone. That was a little bit of a hard act to follow, but I think it actually sets up some really interesting questions that hopefully we can dive into a little bit more today, both in my speech and then I hope in a pretty animated Q&A session. So I'm going to try to keep this relatively short, and then I really welcome any questions that you guys want to share. So today I want to talk about the power of impact evaluation to guide our decisions on where to spend our time and resources, as well as some specific areas where I think there are limitations to that, and we heard a little bit about that already from Maureen Stewart, and how we might still make thoughtful decisions about where to direct our efforts in the absence of rigorous evidence. I worked as a professional evaluator, but I consider myself an amateur Christian, so I'm going to speak a little bit more from the former perspective, but I'm happy to kind of tie those things together a little bit more, maybe in the discussion. I've spent about 12 years working in international development, as Vesa was describing. I started off in a very hands-on role as a teacher and a librarian at a school in a migrant camp in Northwest India. And so that was incredibly fulfilling work for all the reasons that you can imagine, but it also threw up lots of questions for me very quickly about whether we were having the desired impact and whether I, as an individual, was really maximizing my contributions, or whether I was kind of filling a slot that could be taken by somebody else who could maybe do a better job. And all of those questions together led me to pivot pretty quickly into the world of impact evaluation. And so I went on to work for one of JPAL's co-founders running field experiments in South India, and then to spend several years working for a nonprofit evaluation consultancy, partnering with nonprofits and social enterprises and government bodies to test and improve their programs targeting the very poor, especially in India. I want to say at the outset that I struggle a little bit with how much I personally identify as an effective altruist, but I certainly share a desire to maximize my impact and be as confident as possible in the effectiveness of what they do. And my career has certainly been spent on a lot of very EA-aligned causes, especially in the field of international development. But at the same time as my day job was supporting kind of large-scale, quantifiable, evidence-based interventions, in my personal life, I often found myself drawn to organizations that looked very different. And so just like at the beginning of my career, when I was working for a very small, very locally grounded education nonprofit, I often found myself volunteering and giving to fairly small organizations, especially those offering very intensive interventions for children. And I did a variety of things, but when I moved back to California, where I'm from, a few years ago, I trained as a court-appointed advocate for child and foster care, which meant doing everything from kind of weekly visits to the park, all the way to writing reports for judges, describing, what that child's priorities and desires were as they navigated this incredibly difficult situation through the family court system. This started as a relatively small time commitment, so it was kind of what I was doing in my spare time versus what I was doing day to day. But it quickly ballooned, as those things do, and as the case became more complicated and placements changed, I found myself spending more and more time on this. And I remember particularly vividly one particular day where at work I was wrapping up the final details of an evaluation report for a really successful education intervention in India that had raised educational outcomes for thousands of children. Something that I'd spent 3 years on conducting the surveys and analyzing the data, and then actually leaving work early to get in my car and drive 3 hours round trip to the child's new placement and try to kind of connect with them in the limited way that was possible at the time. And on that drive, I had plenty of time to think about whether there was something fundamentally incompatible about these two approaches to doing good. And I think both things felt urgent to me and important, but I had to acknowledge that one of them felt maybe less efficient and certainly had much less evidence to support exactly what the concrete outcomes were of all the time and effort that I was pouring into that. And not because, in any way to downplay the need or the urgency of this child, but to realize that there might be better ways to help her, and that it was important for me, as an individual, to be thinking about whether I was bringing kind of all of my rational thought to how to, help support this child and children like her, at the same time as I was maybe motivated by kind of the more emotional pull that I felt to support communities like that. And I think, I bring up this example not because I have some neat answer I'm going to lead you through over the next 20 minutes, but because I don't really have a great answer, and because I think that this is a problem that I imagine many of us confront in different ways, and it might take different forms. But I think all of us are often trading off either implicit or very explicit, as in this case, opportunity costs on how we spend our time and what we do to serve very poor and vulnerable communities. And it's a question that whether or not we're posing it explicitly is something that we're always kind of answering in terms of where we're directing our time and efforts. And so instead of making, the case that this particular use of time was or was not in some sense worth it, I want to spend my time today examining what we mean by rigorous evidence of impact and proposing some guidelines for how we might make decisions in our own careers and volunteer work and giving where there's maybe an absence of evidence. So first, I just want to recap what we mean by rigorous evidence, because I think that gets bandied around a lot, and I think in a way that can kind of lose the grit of what that actually means in practice in terms of collecting data and analyzing it and making these really, at times, difficult determinations. So usually what we're talking about, especially in EA spaces, is conducting a randomized controlled trial or sometimes a natural experiment or quasi-experiment to estimate a program's impact with the most precision and confidence possible. And at a minimum, you need a few things to be able to do that well, right? You need to have an outcome that you can kind of easily define and value. You need a way to observe or capture that outcome, and then you need some type of counterfactual, some kind of comparison that allows you to say, with some level of confidence, that it's the program or the effort that you're making that's causing changes and not just kind of something else going on. And of course, when you look at EA-favored organizations like GiveWell's top charities, they have all of those things. So they're interventions to save lives. That's an easy sell. We can all agree that that's really important. Importantly, saving lives and health outcomes more generally are usually things that we can observe directly. So, it's not necessarily, there are challenges to measuring it, to be sure, but it's something a little bit more concrete that we're able to observe. And in all of those cases, they've undergone rigorous impact evaluations, usually randomized controlled trials, so we can estimate with great confidence and precision, not just that they save lives, but how many lives they save, and importantly, how many lives per dollar spent they save. So what's the cost effectiveness? And I say all that in no way to denigrate those charities. I think that's amazing work, and I think when you find yourself pulled to support that work for your career or for your giving, I think that's a great use of your time and resources. And of course, beyond that, that's like a very narrow field, but then there's lots of other charities that we are able to measure with some level of confidence. And so when we kind of expand to other types of outcomes that we might be interested in, we have really sophisticated assessment tools for things like education outcomes. We have kind of thoughtful, well-established ways of measuring changes in income, or things that are also important that we would need to kind of apply our own values to compare to the value of a life saved. And the great thing about testing programs this way is that you come out with a really high degree of confidence in the results. So if it works, that's great, and that might be something that you want to continue to invest in. And what we talk about a little bit less is if something doesn't work, that's also really valuable information. So when something has been tested and found to not be effective, that's something that we can act on. We can pivot, we can do something different, we can redirect our resources elsewhere. But there are many programs and interventions that don't have this evidence available. And I think when we heard Rory Stewart talk, he gave the example of some that were just kind of criminally wasteful. And I'm actually not talking about those there. I think that there are programs where it sounds like even at first glance, it's clear that the money did not go towards something that's going to kind of justify those expenditures. But in many cases, and especially in my work actually as an evaluator, we were working with organizations that were incredibly thoughtful about impact, that really wanted to do better, and that for a variety of reasons had not been subjected to an impact evaluation. And I think the really easy cases are when it's a matter of kind of timing or scale. So there's lots of really early stage or relatively small organizations that simply cannot do an impact evaluation, especially maybe in their current state. And I think in the EA community, we're fairly comfortable with that, right? We understand that there's kind of a case to be made for incubating innovations and maybe waiting and seeing and collecting some data along the way, often with the idea that eventually we'll be able to test that and have some greater level of confidence about the effectiveness. But what I want to talk about today, and what I find much trickier, are programs that for various reasons may never be suitable for an impact evaluation, at least using our current tools. And this actually got touched on quite a bit in Rory's talk, unexpectedly. Programs that have transformative impact across many different dimensions, especially those that we don't have great assessment tools for, I think are one category. Programs that have very long-term effects, especially intergenerationally, are things that are really challenging to capture fully. And then I think this is kind of the trickiest category of all. Programs that have meaningful but very difficult to measure effects on things like, as Rory was saying, dignity and agency and resilience and kind of a sense of justice. And those are things that we know we really value kind of on a personal level and have really struggled to translate into the evaluation frameworks that we have available. And finally, and I think this comes up a lot in the EA world as well, is anything involving system change. So something like advocacy, political activism, something where you imagine there might be some kind of tipping point. It's really hard to quantify what 1 extra hour spent on that is going to mean in terms of outcomes. And yet we often find ourselves drawn to that, or kind of hoping or expecting that that might be worth that investment at some point. So I'm saying all of this not to say that we shouldn't value rigorous evidence or impact evaluations. Far from it. I mean, my whole career has been spent on really trying to the degree possible to generate that kind of evidence. However, I do think it's really important for us as individuals and us as kind of representatives of the organizations that we work with to remember that an absence of evidence isn't always an evidence of absence of impact. And that when we talk about something being quantifiable, that's often more of a statement about our abilities as evaluators, rather than necessarily the inherent value of the program or what it's trying to accomplish. And if we think back to that foster care example, that's a program that I think falls squarely in several of those categories. So the desired outcomes range from many things that we might be able to observe, so things like graduating from school or getting a job, to many things that we probably can't, like forming secure attachments or building resilience or avoiding kind of long-term mental health issues or trauma that might reverberate not just through that one person's life, but through generations to come. And of course, that impact, if it happens, would happen over an incredibly long time frame. So that leaves us in kind of a tricky position where, if we think that that's a valuable a valuable effort, or if we think another type of intervention or program is valuable, that we are once again making decisions under conditions of uncertainty, which is really frustrating because I think that's what rigorous evidence is supposed to kind of mitigate and help with in the first place. So I want to close by offering some thoughts on how I think we can make decisions on where to spend our time and money under uncertainty, and being aware of the pitfalls along the way. I mean, as Rory Sturla was saying, we can hear incredibly compelling stories about how things might be impactful. We've all seen many examples of where that failed. And so is there any middle ground to strike between stories on one hand and kind of hard evidence on the other? And I think that answer actually looks different depending on what our position is. So as individuals, I think that means making an effort to understand what evidence is available and making decisions accordingly about where to direct efforts. And I think that when we think about some of these kind of extreme cases of really failed programs, there are some ways to spot those clearly. And I think Roy Stewart was a little bit dismissive of the idea of a compelling story, but I will say that not every organization even has that. Sometimes it's really hard to pin down what exactly is trying to be accomplished, how we'll know it when we see it. And so I think that is actually the first kind of screening that all of us should be applying to the organizations or efforts that we're considering being involved in. I think the second is understanding what are the key steps towards achieving that and what data can be gathered, even if that falls short of a rigorous randomized controlled trial. So we're often talking in that case about a theory of change, but you can break that down into even less technical language and talk about, what are things that are necessary if not sufficient to achieve that impact. And Rory's example, clearly, if we're only building 2 latrines and offering buckets, that's not even meeting kind of the minimum level of inputs that we would need to have the desired impact that would justify such an expensive program. But there are many other examples like that, and I think often we're talking about really basic things like attendance. If you're offering trainings and no one's showing up, that doesn't, that allows us to rule out impact, even if we might have a harder time ruling it in. As organization leaders, I think that means really paying attention to those opportunities to measure what we can, and understanding that even if we fall short of a randomized controlled trial, that there are many opportunities to carefully track process indicators and to build off of existing evidence. And one thing that I find really encouraging is I think in the evaluation community now, there are more and more resources to do that well. So things like Innovation for Poverty Action, Goldilocks Toolkit that they've published with really concrete directions and instructions on how to do that from the perspective of an organization. I think it is incredibly useful, and I think it's nice to see that we're moving in the direction of kind of fleshing out what it means to build kind of a broader body of evidence rather than just going for the gold standard. And finally, I think that as evaluators, that means pushing for new and better methodologies to answer questions. So where we're unclear on how to measure certain things, like resilience, I think there's room for more additional work to develop better assessment tools and come up with more creative methodologies that may not involve randomized controlled trials, but involve other types of rigorous evaluation. And then finally, as we make these decisions as individuals, I think there's a few other things to keep in mind. One is that I think we can each just be honest and clear with ourselves about what our risk appetite is. So acknowledging when we are devoting our efforts towards something that may not pay off, and really kind of grappling with the consequences of that. For me personally, I realized kind of inadvertently, I think I've come up with what I would almost term a portfolio approach. And so I think my comfort with spending some time on things where the immediate impact was maybe a little bit less clear is maybe mitigated by getting to spend my career kind of in that land of certainty and gathering firsthand data on effectiveness. And I think for each of us, that's going to look a little bit different. And then finally, I think we can factor in all the other reasons for doing things, including like one's own learning, strengthening your resolve and commitment, or challenging your own assumptions, or purely kind of the fulfillment that you get out of an activity. And I think those are all kind of valid things to factor in when we think about how we spend each hour of our day. For me, I think it was realizing that all of those things could be true of the work that I was doing in foster care. So it could be, and this was a possibility I had to accept, that supporting just one child was in some sense a less cost-effective or efficient way to do good in the world. It could also be true, and both of these things could be true at once, that our existing frameworks were in some sense kind of undercounting the value of that more intensive intervention in somebody's life at a really important inflection point. And then finally, and this is kind of where I landed, it could be true that it's worth doing anyway for all of those reasons that I just listed. And so, my final call is not to say that we should dismiss the value of rigorous evidence, but to kind of leave open the idea that if our talents or our passions or opportunities lead us away from kind of the very narrow set of, give well top charities, that we don't need to kind of give up on the idea of using our reason and our rational selves to try to make the best determination about what the best use is of our service and charity. So I'll pause there and really welcome kind of more of a discussion on this, since as I said, I think a lot of these things are effectively kind of open questions that we might all be grappling with in different ways.
All right, thank you so much, Kate. We have about 15 minutes, a little under 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So we'll first take questions from the audience. I'll also be monitoring questions from our online participants. I'll be asking them or reading them at some point. But let's start with the live audience. So I think James was probably first.
I've got 2 questions, so maybe pick one or as you wish. The first is, obviously the Local Innovation Fund, RCTs are like a gold standard. You alluded to it, but what's your advice to probably the majority of charities, given the kind of bell curve, that just can't afford to even think about an RCT?
Yeah.
They probably don't even know what it is. Or would they just never kind of come into the realm of your level of funding? That's sort of question number one. Question number two is, I'm aware that is who you work for, isn't it?
Global Innovation.
Yeah. I'm aware that you guys have funded one Christian organisation I'm aware of, who I think are the global leaders in measuring spiritual impact. Any comment on Christians being distinctive in this space, doing robust impact measurement and impressing an organisation like GIF, but whilst also being overt about their Christian faith? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and not to dodge, but I don't have a lot of direct knowledge of your second question.
Okay.
So I think I might redirect to the first one where I do have some thoughts.
I mean, the second question should be like any comment on spiritual impact and doing it robustly with regard to clients.
Yeah. Well, to your first point about what can charities do that can't do an RCT, I mean, I think this was in many ways the question for me, especially in my time at Insight, my previous employer. Because frankly, a lot of the conversations that I had were about counseling organizations away from evaluating their impact, or at least away from trying to do an RCT. I think the typical way this would go was somebody saying, we want to do an RCT, and then kind of asking some probing questions to find out that either there was no way to randomize what they were doing, they were at a very early stage, and kind of the program details were changing day to day, that somebody had already evaluated a very similar program, that there was a way to kind of, build off of the existing evidence base. I mean, all of those things are often reasons not to make that huge investment of time and energy, especially when you think about the opportunity cost of kind of reinvesting all of that into the program and making it better in other ways. So ID Insight as an organization and myself kind of as an individual actually started kind of adding additional services as a result. And so I think our typical counsel to organizations like that is to really think about what stage you're at and then what is the appropriate type of evidence for that stage. And so often that would mean something like building a really solid monitoring system. It would mean developing a really thoughtful theory of change. And often it meant kind of tracking intermediate outcomes or kind of outputs that were a little bit earlier in that theory of change in a way that, again, kind of didn't guarantee impact, but would allow you to exclude the possibility of no impact, which is what happens if something is fundamentally not working about the actual implementation. So, that's not just us. I mean, when I was at ID Insight, we published a toolkit for free online that walks through kind of all of those steps, and including kind of self-diagnosing as an organization where you might be and what might be the most appropriate activity to engage in at that stage. And then I mentioned the Goldilocks toolkit earlier. I think Innovations for Poverty Action similarly has created a team around this and published a lot of public resources. So I think what's encouraging is, I think what organizations were hearing for a while was this binary of like, you're either evidence-based and have an RCT, or you don't have anything to show. And I think there's a lot of territory in between, and it was kind of incumbent on evaluators and probably funders as well to be clear about what other activities would be compelling and important, especially in an earlier stage.
Thank you. I think Sam was second.
I don't have many questions, but I'll give a scenario, and I'd like to, if you can, walk me through how you go about solving it. So say I have very certain information about how good cash transfers are, plenty of RCTs, meta-analysis, etc. And then I have some limited evidence without RCTs about effective lead exposure. And I have limited resources, and I want to know whether I should fund one or the other. How do I go about comparing these, considering they have different evidence and different perspective evidence? How would you do that? Do I discount one? Is there something that's less subjective than just putting a 10% discount on one?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's frustrating is, there's almost always going to be some element of subjectivity in terms of how we value different outcomes. And I think that the best thing that we can do in many cases is just make explicit as possible the assumptions that are going into something. And I think that's something that organizations like GiveWell do incredibly well. I mean, there's not many organizations that are so explicit about things that are often quite uncomfortable, kind of how we're valuing the value of a human life, or, what does that change if you're talking about different ages, or, those are really difficult conversations to have, but implicitly we're doing that all the time. And I think it's, when you're making these kind of hard choices between different programs that you can invest in, usually you just want to be really clear about what the sources of those uncertainty are, and then what kind of model what that looks like under very different conditions. And so that's actually something that I do a lot in my current job, where we often, are funding pretty early stage innovations. We don't know for sure kind of whether it'll, the company will grow at the rate that we're expecting. And so we're usually looking at ranges and trying to make that as explicit as possible about what's kind of the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario, what does the existing evidence say about kind of the range of possible outcomes. And taking all of that together, you're often going to come up with kind of a really different possible states of the world, but still something that's a little bit more, I think, quantifiable and concrete to guide those decisions.
Can I ask a follow-up? Is that okay?
If it's a quick one, yeah.
Let's say if the range is really large, but so the averages say clearly like the uncertain one is better. Is the uncertainty playing a role here? Like if I have massive uncertainty but the average tells me it's better, is that okay?
I mean, I think that kind of gets back to risk appetite, both for, maybe you as an organization or a funder, or you as an individual deciding where to apply your efforts. And I think that, is kind of an individual or organizational level determination. So there isn't one right answer, but I think it's worth being clear with yourself about what your personal answer is.
Okay, then I think in this order, and then
Sorry, first.
you're first, yes.
Thank you. So I have a question about adverse kind of effects of what organizations are doing. Often I get nervous about very efficient organizations because that actually means that often they're so concentrated on measuring what they do that they're not at all attuned to unintended or intended, but just not kind of aware of what kind of adverse effects they actually have involved. So I'd be interested in hearing what advice you have from your career in impact measurements about how to detect kind of adverse impacts, as opposed to just kind of are we having impact on your conversation?
Yeah. And do you have a specific example? Because I can imagine lots of different potential types of adverse effects, and there would be different ways to kind of go about safeguarding against that.
Yeah, I mean, so without naming names, the large organization I was working with, we're working briefly with at one point, was it had this great program for Christian students to kind of to go to university in a context where they might not be able to otherwise, and to have kind of this group of mentor that can go into the university. But it turned out when I was kind of in my context for what the students program played out, that the way they were defining Christian in a country that is 60% Catholic was evangelical. And so there's kind of these very painful cases I was seeing of these excellent students who couldn't go to university because they were Catholic in this context. I mean, that's what I think goes.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the reason that's a thorny problem is that there's not one right answer, but I would say that there's at least a few things that should always be happening. I mean, I think that's one reason to have feedback mechanisms, and not to bring everything back to a robust monitoring system, but I think that those types of ways to not just solicit input and kind of feedback from frontline staff, but also from program participants. The reason that's so crucial is that you can be then open to the idea that there's something that isn't being captured in your model. And so, usually at the point where you're doing an impact evaluation, you have a pretty clear sense of what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to define it. But there's a lot of activities that usually add up to that, and things as simple as kind of open-ended interviews and focus groups and really kind of pressure testing earlier versions of that program, I think usually help to weed out that type of kind of adverse impact. But no, I mean, I think I wish the answer wasn't just kind of constant vigilance and site visits, but I think that's probably part of it. And I think that part of the answer is also kind of when we talk about data collection, we're not just kind of talking about dry survey answers, but really being open to observing and listening to things that challenge your narrative all the time.
Okay, thank you. Then, as we move on to the other questions.
So I was wondering how you think about evaluating theories of change that throw in Pascal's money, like for example, existential risk scenarios, or when you model welfare. A lot of issues in the EA community were like, the argument is like, this is infinitely bad or good, before we have to solve this. And I'm just wondering how you think about evaluating these things, either across issues or you're just like, go to one case, and how do you even begin to evaluate this kind of problem when there is no empirical evidence of whether it will work or not? Does that make sense?
Would you like elaborate on that a little bit? I want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah, so like, if someone says AI risk will kill everyone and all of society, this is infinitely bad, according to them, right?
Yeah.
But we don't empirical evidence that that's the case. Or if someone says, if we don't stop insects from being farmed, like trillions of bees will be killed and suffer every month or year, right?
Yeah.
And we have no way to know that's true because we don't know what's scientific, right?
Yeah.
And so, like in this case, the theory of change embeds an assumption that makes the argument sort of a clearer case, right? If you believe in the theory of change, of course we do the thing, right? But there are lots of theories of change like this other.
Yeah.
And so how do you pick between them, or how do you take one of them and say, I'm going to evaluate this? On what basis do you do that?
I mean, that's a great question. I will start by saying that this is in no way my kind of area of focus or expertise. So, this is a little bit of speculation on my part. I think that's probably less a question about theories of change and kind of more about probability and the models that we use. So, that I think that the kind of at a minimum what we can do is kind of be constantly updating the assumptions that we feed into those models, like as more data and information becomes available. But then in terms of kind of how we make those determinations, I think that's a really challenging and open question. I don't think that's going to be necessarily answered out of the world kind of in a national development impact evaluation.
Sure. Okay, thank you. And then we have the most voted questions online. First one, how would you recommend small charities monitor impact?
I mean, I think that that's kind of what we talked about in the first question, but I think it's identifying about and measuring kind of the necessary preconditions for impact. And so I think we are appropriately often skeptical of claims that rest on kind of reach. When somebody says, oh, our program reached 1,000 people, I think we're a little bit trained now to say that's not impact, that's just breadth of reach. But that's actually a really important kind of precondition. If they reached 0 people, we know there's no impact. If they reached 50, you can kind of start making some calculations about the amount spent and pretty swiftly rule that out as maybe a good use of funds. And so I think it's a little bit uncomfortable, but kind of getting comfortable with this incomplete information and trying to kind of plug that into what we know about what the possible impact is or what we might expect and making some determinations as a result.
Thank you. And then the second one, what do you think about mental health as an EA course area?
I mean, I think that's a really great example of one of the things that I think we're right now kind of inadequately prepared to measure. And I think that there is a lot of research in this area, and I think that there should be more, because I think when we talk about things like mental health, we're often defining it pretty narrowly in terms of the desired outcomes. And if we're thinking about it in more of a narrative way, we're talking about kind of intergenerational trauma and huge changes to kind of how somebody's life might evolve. And I think those are all excellent examples of things that we're often not kind of fully capturing when we think about ways to evaluate programs that are trying to affect that change.
Okay, thank you. It's time to wrap up this session. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.